President Joe Biden and the leaders of Australia and the United Kingdom on Monday announced that Australia will purchase nuclear-powered attack submarines from the United States. The move to modernize the Australian fleet has been seen as a major step to counter China's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. It's a deal set to cost Australia up to $245 billion by 2055, and will see the country receive between 3 and 5 vessels. Yinka Oyatade reports.
It's all smiles from the leaders of the US, UK and Australia as they look to cement their alliance with the unveiling of plans to develop nuclear-powered attack submarines, this under the so-called AUKUS project.
It's an unusual name, AUKUS, but it's a powerful entity. You know, when our countries first announced AUKUS 18 months ago, I'm not at all sure that anyone believed that how much progress we'd be able to make together and how quickly we'd accomplish it.
The deal will see the US sell 3 American-made Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines to Australia by the early 2030s, with an option to buy 2 more if needed. They would include vessels either pulled from Washington's own stock or ones made from scratch. Britain and Australia will then take over submarine production, building a new collection of underwater crafts that will incorporate American technology. Those subs are projected to enter Australia's fleet by the 2040s. Also under the pact, US and British vessels will be deployed to a base near Perth, this to help train Australian crews and bolster deterrence. The plans will cost a whopping $245 billion American dollars by 2055. It's money well spent for the Allies as they push to prevent China's military build-up in Asia.
This is primarily about China, about keeping order in the Asia-Pacific, because China is becoming more assertive, more belligerent, one might say. This is in response to that development, which has been accelerating so quickly within just the past couple of years.
The unveiling of the deal comes after Canberra abandoned plans to purchase submarines from France in 2021, a package worth $66 billion. The move angered Paris and sparked a brief row between all 3 countries.
Bank stocks plunged worldwide on Monday, even as Joe Biden vowed to ensure the safety of the US banking system. And it follows the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank due to lack of sufficient liquidity, with many now fearing a domino effect. American banks Silvergate and Signature are also in hot water as major financial institutions lost around $90 billion statewide, evoking memories of the 2008 financial crash. Jenny Shin reports.
It had a place among the top 20 largest banks in the US until last Friday. Hot in demand as the banker to tech startups through the pandemic years, Silicon Valley Bank invested heavily in US Treasury bonds when interest rates were low. When it suddenly found itself in need of cash after interest rate hikes by the US Federal Bank, SVB was forced to sell US bonds at a significant loss. Spooked depositors rushed to withdraw their funds, and SVB quickly collapsed. Experts say the bank raised several red flags before its demise.
The concentration in one industry, the explosive growth over the last year, they literally doubled in size from 100 some odd billion to over 200 billion in assets, catapulting them into one of the largest size echelon of banks in the U.S.
The developments raised the specter of 2008, when the subprime meltdown led to the financial crisis. In a speech to put out the fire, President Joe Biden reassured the nation that the situation is under control.
Today, thanks to the quick action of my administration over the past few days, Americans can have confidence that the banking system is safe. Your deposits will be there when you need them. Small businesses across the country, the deposit accounts at these banks can breathe easier knowing they'll be able to pay their workers and pay their bills.
Biden said he will also seek tougher banking regulations, vowing to bring those accountable to justice. But the events have already sent ripples through the financial sector, with bank shares in Europe and Asia sinking before the US opening on Monday. Meanwhile, SVB has been put up for auction by US authorities in hopes to avoid total bankruptcy. The UK arm of the bank is already being purchased in a rescue deal by British bank HSBC for the symbolic price of £1.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his country's future hinges on the outcome of the fight for Bakhmut. It comes as a violent battle with Russia intensifies around the city, with neither side showing any sign of backing down. And it's also the longest running and bloodiest battle of Moscow's invasion, with troops from either side fighting closer and closer. Camille Knight compiled this report.
As the battle for Bakhmut intensifies, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to hold on to the city. On this footage, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces can be seen encouraging his men. There's one key objective: containing the Russian enemy outside of the centre of Bakhmut.
I'd like to express my gratitude one more time that you exist, that you're defending our land, killing the enemy. You're performing an important task because you're buying us time to train the reserves. We must beat them.
On Sunday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his men had inflicted huge losses on the Russian side.
In less than a week, since the 6th of March, and in the Bakmut sector alone, they've managed to eliminate more than 1,100 enemy soldiers, which are irreversible losses for Russia. Losses near Bakmut.
Bakhmut has become a symbol of Ukraine's unrelenting resistance against the Russians, reflected in the words of Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of paramilitary group Wagner, who admitted that the fighting was increasingly challenging.
The situation in Bakhmut is tough, very tough. The enemy fights for every metre, and the closer we are to the centre of the city, the harder the battles. The Ukrainians throw in endless reserves, but we are advancing, and we will continue to advance.
Meanwhile, Moscow continues to reassure public opinion with these pictures from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Advancing tanks, soldiers in action, as if to show the conquest of new territory by the Russian army.
Well, meanwhile, Russian officials say that another extension of the grain deal with Ukraine is on the table. However, it's only for 60 days, half the term previously consented to by Moscow. The deal allows the safe export of grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports and is seen as crucial in preventing a global food crisis. Ukraine says the announcement by Russia goes against the UN and Turkey brokered agreement. Vedika Bahal tells us more.
After hours of talks, Russia's deputy foreign minister leaves the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. On the table was the vital deal that allows the safe export of grains from Ukraine's blockaded Black Sea ports, to which Moscow says a renewal is possible.
Russia does not object to another extension of the Black Sea Initiative after its second term expires on March 18th, but only for 60 days. Our further stance will be determined upon tangible progress on normalization of our agricultural exports, not in words, but in deeds.
This extension, however, is half the term of its previous renewals, and Ukraine's Minister of Infrastructure says that this isn't long enough.
The Black Sea Grain Initiative involves at least 120 days of extension. Therefore, Russia's position to extend the deal only for 60 days contradicts the document signed by Turkey and the UN. We're waiting for the official position of the UN and Turkey as the guarantors of the initiative.
The UN and Turkey brokered initiative was first signed last July to establish a safe 4-month maritime corridor to and from Ukrainian ports. And it was seen as averting a global food crisis that threatened several countries due to blocked Russian and Ukrainian shipments. It was subsequently extended again last November for another 120 days, with its expiry date creeping up at the end of the week. As of this month, more than 23 million tons of grain had been exported under the initiative, and it remains to be seen whether the deal will face further extension on Saturday.
Time for some more international news making headlines. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been received by his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron at the Elysee on Monday night. Orban remains one of the most outspoken critics of Europe's stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, criticizing sanctions leveled against Moscow. Then thousands of tons of rubbish remained littered across the streets of Paris on Monday. This as garbage collectors' strike against the government pension reforms continued. 3 incineration plants outside the capital have been hit by the work stoppages that have left entire pavements covered in black bags and overflowing bins. And former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, is set to be called to testify as part of an investigation. He tried to illegally bring $3.2 million worth of jewelry into the country. Luxury jewelry gifted by the Saudi government to Bolsonaro and his wife was seized by customs officials in October 2021 after it was found in the backpack of a government aide. Well, Bolsonaro has denied those claims. More than 100 people have died in Malawi and Mozambique following Cyclone Freddy's return to southern Africa's mainland. Freddy is on track to become the longest lasting storm on record, having made a comeback for the second time within a few weeks. The impact has been made worse, with Malawi already grappling with the deadliest cholera outbreak in history. Vedic Bahal once again brings us the latest.
Digging through the mud despite relentless rain, these residents are looking for buried survivors after Cyclone Freddy tore through their city, triggering mudslides and flash floods. The tropical storm has pounded Malawi, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake, damaging power lines, toppling trees, with scores dead and injured.
We are still looking for more victims. I'm using this hoe to try and find someone.
It was bad at night, but now that it's daytime, I can feel the loss. I've never seen something so terrible. My neighbours' houses are all gone, and the family members are gone, all missing.
I'm helping to find the victims. I know there are more bodies that are still buried. Most of them have been ferried to the hospital, but they all looked dead.
The government has declared a state of disaster in the southern region and is appealing for local and international aid to help those affected. Having formed off northwestern Australia early February, Freddy surged across the entire southern Indian Ocean and has pummeled Malawi's neighbours Madagascar and more recently Mozambique, although the full extent of the damage or loss of life there is not yet clear. Freddy is one of the most powerful tropical storms ever recorded in the southern hemisphere and could also be the longest lasting one, according to the World Meteorological Organization.
And finally, in a move which has evoked outcry from environmental groups, the Biden administration has approved a massive oil drilling project in Alaska. It's known as the Willow Project, and it could produce up to 180,000 barrels per day, or 1.5% of total U.S. oil production. But critics have been left angered by the president, saying this contradicts previous pledges to slow climate change. Caroline Lambolet takes a closer look.
It's the largest proposed oil drilling project on U.S. public land in decades. Supporters say it will bring hundreds of jobs and billions of dollars in revenue to state and federal coffers. But some local voices and nationwide groups have raised concerns about its impact on the environment.
The decision to approve Willow is in direct conflict with the urgent need to transition the United States and the world off fossil fuels. The administration continues to give lip service to the desire to be strong on the climate and strong in protecting environmental justice. These projects don't do that. Instead, they take us in the wrong direction and undermine our ability to actually build a livable future we need.
On Sunday, the Biden administration had said it would bar or limit drilling in some other areas of Alaska and the Arctic Ocean, a move that some groups described as an attempt to sugarcoat Monday's decision to okay the Willow Project. The project is located in Alaska's pristine western Arctic, in an area known as the National Petroleum Reserve. It will sit on the state's North Slope, the largest tract of undisturbed public land in the U.S. Using the oil generated by the project would produce the equivalent of more than 239 million metric tons of greenhouse gases over 30 years. That's roughly equivalent to the combined emissions from 1.7 million passenger cars over the same time period. Still, though, there is widespread support in Alaska itself from across the political spectrum. One exception, though, is the mayor of Nuiqsut, whose city of around 500 people is closest to the proposed project.
2 other Americans are also imprisoned alongside Siamak, Emad Shari and Morad Tahbaz. They call themselves hostages and that they are pawns caught up in the decades-long standoff between Tehran and Washington. Just ahead, we'll hear from one of their daughters. But first, my next guest has made it his mission to try to help. Bill Richardson has been an American cabinet secretary. He's been ambassador to the UN and the former governor of New Mexico, a longtime interlocutor with regimes like Russia, North Korea, and more to secure the release of American captives. And he's joining me now from Albuquerque. Governor, welcome back to our program. It's a long time since we've spoken, and I just want to get your opinion based on your experience. These dueling narratives and claims now about any kind of a deal to get the remaining Americans in Iranian prison released and returned.
Well, what my role is we work for the families, like the Sharji family and others that are parents or families of wrongfully detained. I am not the lead negotiator. I'm not a negotiator, but I've talked to both sides, the Iranians and our very capable Iran envoy, Rob Malley. There's very serious negotiations going on, but I agree with the administration view. There is no deal at this time, but they're meeting intensively. And the victims here are these three Americans that are suffering, that are wrongfully detained, that are being used as political pawns. And this has happened in Russia, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea. It's a pattern. It's a new hostage diplomacy that we have to start confronting. And this president, I believe, has done a good job so far.
Well, I'm going to get to that later about how one does start confronting, more on a global issue. But can I just then put to you this rather heartbreaking plea that Siamak Namazi asked me to be able to direct to the president himself via the media, via us. This is what he said on Thursday to us.
President Biden, I certainly hear and I sincerely appreciate your administration's repeated declarations that freeing the American hostages in Iran is its top priority. But I remain deeply worried that the White House just doesn't appreciate how dire our situation has become. It's also very hurtful and upsetting that after 25 months in office, you haven't found the time to meet with our families. Just to give them some words of assurance. Sir, Morad, Ahmad, and I have now collectively languished here for 18 years. Our lives and families have been utterly devastated. We desperately need you to finally conclude that we've suffered long enough as Iran's hostages.
You can hear the emotion, a man who's been unjustly held in an Iranian prison for 7.5 years, plus the other two. So I want to ask you, based again on your experience with other such cases and lobbying for families, do you think that the president could and should, as a matter of just comfort and commitment, meet with Namazi family, the Tahbaz family, the Shari family?
Yes, the president should meet with them. And the president in the past with Trevor Reed and the Greiners case and other families has met with them. I think the president should meet with them. I think it's the responsibility of every president to try to get American hostages home regardless. And usually if it's a prisoner exchange or it's some kind of deal, it's worthy to do, even though it may be unseemly. So, yes, I think the president should meet with them. And I would support the president if he makes a negotiated deal with the Iranians. I think it's our responsibility to bring these three home. They've suffered enough. Their families have suffered. We we work very closely with one of the families, the Sharji family. I think it's important that it happen. But so far, I think if you look at the record on Venezuela, on Russia, the president does meet with these families. He should do that.
So why do you think he hasn't, Governor?
They deserve to be heard.
They're appealing for that desperately. Well, why do you think in this case, and is Iran, particularly now, super sensitive in some way? Is the case of Iran something that's unpalatable for the president?
No. I think here's two issues. One, I think the president may be waiting, and I'm not the negotiator, for some kind of framework of a deal to happen. So he's waiting for that. That hasn't happened yet. And I think what might happen is a meeting where a framework is close He should meet with them regardless. These are wonderful Americans, and they're Americans. And many that I have dealt with around the world, they're American veterans, and they're wrongfully detained. And there may be 70 around the world. So he should, I think it's the duty of every president to do that. They don't always listen to me, but yes. And I think your interview shows the pain that many of these Americans have, and they want hope. And it's the president that can make this happen.
So you know, you've said correctly that presidents, you know, and we're just talking about Iran now, presidents from, I guess, Ronald Reagan, have made these deals to get Americans back, whether they are the American hostages in the embassy over the revolution, whether they were the ones held in Lebanon, whether they are several prisoner swaps that have happened, and certainly Siamak has not been released, and in the last few years, nor has Tahbaz and Shari. So do you think the president can persuade, you know, the usual suspects who would disagree, you know, whether it's the conservatives in Congress, whether it's the conservative media? Do you think that he can sell this a proposal to make a deal with Iran for American citizens?
Well, as I understand it, and I've talked to both sides, I think that what is involved here is not necessarily prisoner exchange, but I'm not going to go into the details of the other issues. So is a deal doable? Yes. Is it possible? Yes. Is it going to be soon? I believe so. I'm an optimist. The Griner deal was a swap with a man named Boot, who was a horrendous person.
Right.
It may not be a good deal that will please everybody, conservatives, Republicans, whatever. But I think it's a solemn duty of a president to do everything he or she can to bring Americans home. And I'm optimistic, but I don't have the details. We should be very circumspect. Look, the relationship with Iran is not good. We have a nuclear treaty that probably is in shambles, but that doesn't mean that on humanitarian issues, on issues relating to prisoners, Americans wrongfully detained, that the president shouldn't make a deal. And it's probably not going to be popular, but I'll support him. And I think many will support him, as they did with the Griner deal, with Trevor Reed, with Venezuelans. The president is an empathetic guy. He's good at these meetings with families. He should do that.
So you're going to recommend to him. Soon. You could pick up the phone. You could pick up the phone and suggest it.
They don't always listen to me.
Right.
I mean, I don't work for them.
No, I know.
I have a foundation. I work for the families.
I know.
You know, so I hope he does.
Okay, so let me ask you this.
And I think if there's a deal,
you're saying that he could sell it, and of course they have done in the past. Many Americans have been freed, having been held by Iran, often in order to get their own money back. It appears that this deal, brokered by Qatar, is about giving Iran the money that South Korea should have paid, and actually not going straight to Iran, but in an escrow account used for humanitarian purchases. South Korea got oil worth some $7 billion, and Iran wants the money back. And it appears Qatar has figured out something from the Iranian side that seems acceptable. And next it has to go to the US, which so far deems it not acceptable. So let's play devil's advocate for a moment, because there is a whole sort of global notion. Any kind of deal to get anybody back, does it not risk encouraging the same countries, other countries to do that? Is there a way to get some kind of global, treaty on this kind of issue so that these issues are dealt with in partnership?
Well, I think the first thing we should do is we should publicly announce that any country that wrongfully detains Americans is going to get sanctioned immediately, not just individual people, but industries, et cetera. That's one. Number two, as unpleasant as it is, it should be the foreign policy duty of our country, especially if it involves American veterans, especially if they're wrongfully detained, or the three in Iran, for us to do whatever it takes to bring them back. It could be unpopular. It could be a bad person in a prisoner exchange. But in this case, I'm not going to go into details. One of the problems is that Iran and the United States don't talk to each other. So we have to do it through intermediaries. And that has been a problem. But progress is being made, and our government is trying very hard to get them out. But at the very least, meet with them, feel the pain of the parents, of the families, and find a way to make this happen. I will support the president, no matter what the deal is.
Yeah.
But
let me just finally ask you.
We all should.
Yes, certainly the families do believe that, obviously, and there's so much precedent, as you said, including for Brittany Griner, who, let's face it, was, released in an exchange during a period where the United States is, in a way, certainly adversarial with Russia, who is holding her right now. Anyway, I want to ask you, in terms of American foreign policy, what you make, and should the United States be concerned, of China now acting as a peace broker, if you like, certainly between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This has really set a lot of the foreign policy establishment, on its, steam is coming out of their ears, because it's so extraordinary that A, China would do this, and B, cut out the Americans, and C, between two such strong adversaries in that region.
Well, it is a significant development, but is it a tectonic shift? I don't think so. And I think we have to have a vision and a strategy to deal with it. Here's the way I see it. Number one, Russia is moving with China into a anti-U.S. Europe axis. I think that's what is happening. Number two, the Saudis, when I was energy secretary, they were steadfast allies. I'm not sure they are anymore. They're playing all sides, mainly with the Eastern Bloc, with Russia and China. I think Iran has gotten some cover in the region by this arrangement, and China is a geopolitical player. So what do we have to do? First, we don't panic. When you exchange relations, diplomatic relations, doesn't mean then that Iran and Saudi Arabia are immediately friends. There's still a lot of grievances with each other. But we got to adapt to this. And my answer is engagement, dialogue. Talk to bad people. I've done it all my life. Not that it's always worked.
Yep.
But you got to have a dialogue. You got to have engagement. You can't just say, oh, this is terrible. What are we going to do? No, let's deal with it. Let's have a strategy. Let's have a vision. It is significant.
All right.